Welcome to Young Voices Debates number 3. We are very happy to have you all. We have a booked room, almost 150 of you fitting in this lovely venue. Thank you all for coming. All right, so for this debate, it started off a young 26-year-old Syrian American like myself. I had an inkling of motivation that I will explain in detail in a second. And I decided that we need a debate forum that focuses on the issues that matter to young people, ergo young voices. And that is actually how I found Young Voices, the organization that sponsored this event and helped us put it together and helped us fund it. Thank you, Young Voices. And the co-sponsor for this event is civil.com. It's a streaming service that hopes to encourage civil discourse in our current fraught political moment in America. As we all recognize as Americans, debates and conversations are harder to come by, harder to do in a very civilized manner. That's the mission of civil.com. That's their mission. They are helping launch this new version of debate and discourse that is focused on free speech, but also focused on civility. So again, also another round of applause for civil.com for sponsoring this event. Now, the inkling of motivation that I told you about came from someone in this room, actually. His name is Gene Epstein. Gene Epstein is the moderator and the director of the Soho Forum. It's one of the oldest debates societies in New York City, and it's very well established, very well respected. Their thing is they bring debates that vary in interest and vary in ranges. We focus on debates that pertain to the younger audience, and we focus on debaters that are under 40. Gene, if you would like, please come ahead and come here and speak a little bit about Soho Forum. Right here, yeah, you can take my mic. Soho Forum, and introduce upcoming events.
Yes, I'm so proud of my friend Hekmet. Whenever I read about what's happening in the country of Syria, I want to give him a hug. As I'm sure you would want to as well, I started the Soho Forum in September of 2016. I'm proud to brag that one of our debates actually surpassed 7 million YouTube views, and prouder still that it was a debate I did against a Marxist professor who's internationally known. So probably it's because of his fame that the debate has gotten so much attention, 7 million plus, and it added another 70,000 over the last month. But you are all invited. A free ticket, we normally charge $20. If you just write this down, thesohoforum.org, thesohoforum.org, you'll find a debate we're having in January on the subject of El Salvador. Maybe you know what that's about. In February, we're having a debate on the subject of the war in Ukraine. Maybe you know what that's about. In March, we're having a debate on Israel-Palestine. Maybe you know what that is about. If you would like to have a free ticket or two, just write me at gene@thesohoforum.org. Tell me you came to this debate, which will qualify you for 2 free tickets. We normally charge $20 a ticket. Thanks very much. I look forward to this evening.
Thank you, Gene. And now for our debate. So, folks, the topic of today's debate, the resolution reads, the U.S. should fully decriminalize prostitution in all 50 states. And to help us have this civil debate, we've brought 2 exceptional debaters on the topic who have credibility that is unmatched in the field. As I introduce them, I will ask you to take out your phones and scan this QR code and vote declaring your position on this specific resolution before you've heard any of the arguments. This is the way that an Oxford-style debate works. In the beginning, you give us your opinions. We see how many of you agree, disagree, or are undecided on the topic. And then the winner of this debate, at the conclusion of the closing statements by Melanie and Kaytlin, is the person who has gained more of their vote, more of their share of the vote. So, without further ado, let me introduce, first of all, Kaytlin Bailey. Kaytlin, please come to the stage. Kaytlin is a passionate advocate for sex workers' rights. She's also the founder of The Old Pros, a nonprofit dedicated to changing the stigma surrounding sex work. She's also the host of the Oldest Profession podcast. Thank you, Kaytlin. Kaytlin will be taking the proposition. And for the opposition, we have Melanie Thompson. Melanie is an advocacy coordinator at the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women. Melanie is a survivor, leader, and prominent pundit in the space. She's also the host of the Open Wound podcast. Thank you, Melanie. Now, I am assuming that all of you have had your moment to cast your votes and allow us to proceed forward with this debate. If I don't hear any objections, we'll move forward. And this is the run of the show, just for everyone to know and have an idea of what to expect. We have 10 minutes opening statements from both debaters. Then we have 5 minutes rebuttals. And then we have 40 minutes question and answers from the debaters from one to another. And then as a moderator, I have the moderator's prerogative. As I learned very well from Jean, I get to ask my own questions. And then finally, we will take a Q&A from both the audience here live, 120 of you, and audience watching on civil.com. There's about, we will get the numbers, but we have about hundreds of people watching online. So thank you to everyone who is tuning online, and your questions, should you submit them through the civil.com platform, will be heard and will be answered in today's debate. So without further ado, Kaytlin, you will take the first 10 minutes to open this debate. Thank you.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. As a sex worker rights advocate, I've spent my career studying sex workers from history and fighting for the human rights and dignity of sex workers today. My opponent, Melanie Thompson, and I agree on a lot. We agree that no one should be arrested for selling sexual services, that predators should be punished for violence and sexual exploitation in all of its horrific forms, and that traffickers should be brought to justice whether they are forcing somebody to work in a slaughterhouse, a mine, or a brothel. However, Melanie believes that paying for sex is an act of violence in and of itself, and that we should pursue policies that try to eliminate sex work. I believe that sex that would not otherwise be a crime should not become a crime just because someone is getting paid. Now, I know that some people here believe that nobody would ever consent to this work, but I came to sex work with a lot of choices. Like many others, I have a college degree. I've worked as a barista, a waitress, and a bartender, and a nanny, in addition to choosing to do sex work to subsidize my early career in stand-up comedy. I found a message board where sex workers advertised, shared information about safety protocols, and I learned that before meeting somebody, I should ask for their name and references, that I should check their ID and call a friend to make sure that someone knew where I was, who I was with, and what time to expect to hear from me. And the overwhelming majority of my clients treated me with kindness, generosity, and respect. And I know that that isn't everyone's experience. I have brought a lot of privilege to every job I've ever had, including sex work. And still, I was sexually harassed and assaulted at almost every restaurant I ever worked at. I have been raped, and I have been paid for sex, and those were profoundly different experiences. I have met people from all over the world who came to the sex industry for a lot of reasons, working under a variety of legal models and circumstances, who all believe that decriminalizing sex work is the best policy. But before we get too far, let's define our terms. Sex work is a broad umbrella term that means many things, most of which are not illegal. But for our purposes today, I believe that Melanie and I are both talking about prostitution, meaning exchanging in-person sex acts for money or something of value. Now, decriminalizing prostitution means that no one is arrested, evicted, fired, or loses custody of their children just for engaging in adult consensual sex work. Decriminalization does not remove criminal penalties for rape, sexually exploiting a minor, trafficking, assault, kidnapping, or any other crime. Nor does it protect businesses or individuals from health and safety codes, labor laws, or zoning restrictions. Decriminalization is not legalization, which imposes restrictive regulatory systems unique to prostitution, such as mandatory registration, confinement to brothels, and severe limits that do not increase the negotiating power for workers. Melanie is advocating for partial decriminalization, also known as end demand or the Swedish or Nordic model. This policy seeks to eradicate prostitution by criminalizing people who pay for sex or who assist with screening, scheduling, or renting to sex workers. But fully decriminalizing sex work is the only policy that reduces violence. In 2003, New Zealand became the first country to decriminalize adult consensual sex work. And we have over 2 decades of data that shows that this policy reduced violence and STIs and made sex workers much more likely to report crimes and to advocate for their own health and safety. 2 years ago, Belgium became the first country in Europe to decriminalize sex work, and last year they became the first country in the world to offer labor protections, including paid sick and maternity leave to sex workers. New South Wales, Victoria, and Queensland, Australia have all adopted the full decriminalization of sex work because this policy is working. Decriminalization started as a public health policy to address the HIV/AIDS pandemic. And today, the World Health Organization believes that decriminalization would reduce new HIV infections by 46%. We could cut new HIV infections in half by simply not arresting people for engaging in the oldest profession. But it is not just public health officials who support this policy. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the Freedom Network, which is the largest anti-trafficking organization in the United States, all support full decriminalization. Last year, I visited New Zealand and Australia, where I met with advocates and toured brothels and spoke to many sex workers, and I saw firsthand how decades of being able to work without fear of prosecution has enabled sex workers to report crimes, to access and build support services that work for them. I also traveled to Sweden and Norway and Iceland, countries that have adopted the policy that Melanie is advocating for, criminalizing clients and third-party facilitators in an effort to end prostitution. Sweden pioneered this model in 1999, and Norway and Iceland followed suit in 2009, and other countries have adopted this similar laws. But everywhere this policy has been implemented, violence against sex workers goes up. These laws harm sex workers by criminalizing our livelihoods, and you don't have to be an economist to know that financial precarity makes all of us more vulnerable. In Sweden, Norway, and Iceland, sex workers told me how impossible it is to ask criminalized clients for their IDs or references, which leaves them unable to tell the difference between someone who is nervous and someone who is dangerous. And because facilitating prostitution is so broadly defined, sex workers, landlords, and loved ones are often threatened with prosecution as pimps. This, of course, leads to sex workers being evicted, forcing them out onto the street or into unsafe or unstable housing situations. In 2016, Amnesty International published a scathing report demonstrating how these laws are actually being used not to help sex workers, but to target and evict immigrants. Even information about how to screen clients or protect yourself from disease are considered material encouraging a crime and are not supported by public health officials. People found to be distributing this information are threatened with arrest. A woman I met in Sweden is struggling to keep her children out of foster care because a social worker considers her work as a dominatrix to be a form of self-harm. Sex workers I met with in Sweden, Norway, and Iceland told me that they were afraid to report even violent crimes because if the authorities found out about their work, they would do everything that they could to stop them from selling sex before addressing any other issue. Under full decriminalization, sex workers aren't afraid of the police. While I was in New Zealand, a sex worker reported a client for rape, not for paying her for sex, but for removing a condom without her consent. And he was prosecuted. I also met a woman who was working independently, who called the police when a client refused to pay her. The police told him that he could either pay or be arrested for assault. Sex workers and harm reduction organizers are able to operate freely under full decrim, sharing information and getting services to the people who need it. Now, I know that many people who sell sex find the experience traumatizing and degrading and want a way out. And I and many other sex workers support exit programs and services for people who want them. And you don't have to be someone that would ever buy or sell sexual services to support decriminalizing sex work. And you don't have to think that sex work is right or good to understand that people do this and will continue to do this whether it is criminalized or not. We should arrest people who prey on sex workers, but we can't do that by conflating respectful clients with violent criminals. And every dollar we spend arresting consensual adults for engaging in consensual sex work is a dollar not spent pursuing predators. Thank you.
Thank you, Kaytlin. At this point, Melanie, for your opening statement.
Chair, sorry. Good evening, Hekmet, ladies and gentlemen, and Ms. Kaytlin. As a survivor of prostitution and sex trafficking, a women's and LGBTQ+ rights advocate, and as an expert on intersectional oppressions, I am arguing the opposition point that the United States should not decriminalize prostitution. Many of you in this room may not have a personal connection to this topic. Some of you might even be pretty familiar with the points that Kaytlin just laid out. But tonight, I want to challenge you to consider a point of view that might be unfamiliar or uncomfortable. When we talk about consensual adult prostitution, people usually picture a pretty woman scenario. A soft, wide-eyed woman, a handsome, respectful gentleman, a luxurious lifestyle, no violence, no abuse, no coercion. And this is an easy image. It is easy to believe that prostitution is harmless, that it is a victimless crime, that all parties involved are consenting adults, that it doesn't racially discriminate, that it is fun and empowering and sexy, that the money exchanged for a so-called service is fair, and that buyers are respectful men just looking for connection. No harm, no foul, right? Well, for 90+% of us, this is not the case. Although the system of prostitution is still very understudied and the crime of human trafficking wildly underreported, here's what we do know. The majority of us impacted by the system of prostitution are Black, brown, and indigenous. Over 40% of us identify as LGBTQ+. Over 35% are indigenous or undocumented. Over 30% are survivors of familial trafficking. In the US, 1 in 20 are boys, and the remaining majority of us are women and girls. According to NOMAS, an activist and research organization in the US, between 85 to 95% of people in prostitution are part of the no-exit variety, meaning that despite wanting to leave the sex trade, they have no feasible options to exit. So exactly how many consenting adults are we talking about? And I know that there's a lot of talk about conflating human trafficking and sex work, or human trafficking and adult consensual prostitution, and how these two things need to be viewed separately. However, it is important to understand that they are inextricably linked. I like to say that sex trafficking is the vehicle and prostitution is the destination. Most times, individuals are trafficked for the purposes of prostitution, and even those who are in prostitution voluntarily, the harms and abuse and risk of being trafficked are still present because the demand for paid sex and the circumstances that got us into prostitution are still the same. When we talk about policy, we cannot lose sight of the fact that we are talking about human beings. We are discussing prostitution, and the effects that it has on people is not like that of decriminalizing marijuana or gambling, for example. In a study of prostitution survivors interviewed across 5 countries, including the US, nearly 70% met diagnostic criteria for PTSD. As of 2020, 92.2% of women in the sex trade report being subjected to rape, being shot, strangled, burned, beaten, stabbed, or punched. Prostituted women report being urinated, defecated, and ejaculated upon, forced to have unprotected sex, and subjected to the insertion of foreign objects into their bodies. The trauma is horrific and lifelong. Now, I am sure that we have all heard that prostitution is the oldest profession, right? Well, since I know that sex work history is something that some of you might like to indulge in, let's explore that. Just because something is old doesn't make it right. In fact, the historian Gerda Lerner wrote that commercial prostitution likely devolved directly from the enslavement of women, military conquest led in the 3rd millennium BC to the enslavement and sexual abuse of captive women. As slavery became an established institution, slave owners rented out their female slaves as prostitutes, and some masters set up commercial brothels staffed by slaves. So historically, prostitution was never about a woman's choice, but always about men's sexual access to poor and marginalized women's bodies. Does anyone remember that jingle from school? In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Well, that was also the recorded start of the rape, exploitation, and prostitution of indigenous women. According to historical records, there was no prostitution in these indigenous communities until Europeans like Columbus brought it. Black women were brought across the Atlantic and sold by white men for rape, torture, and prostitution. Now let's follow that history line down to the United States today. Over the last few decades, we've seen prostitution change and take many forms. Street walking, VIP backrooms in strip clubs, online website ads, illicit massages, sugar dating, OnlyFans, you name it. What hasn't changed is the disproportionate misogyny and racism toward the people who have been marginalized from the beginning. Black and indigenous folks collectively make up less than 14% of the United States population, yet somehow are representative of over 80% of people purchased for the sexual gratification of the white male majority. And of course, society does not talk about the harms or the abuse inflicted by these buyers, or touch upon how the majority of us are still treated like slaves and animals and products behind closed doors. No. Instead, we pick out the small minority of women who have had the privilege to engage in prostitution without consequences, to represent the masses, and make everyone believe that this is not harmful based on their lucky experiences. A small percent of society wants you to believe that sex work is a job like any other. Sex work is chanted everywhere now, under the false guise that this is just a way to decrease the stigma around those with lucky experiences. That if you focus on the happy hookers and decriminalize the sex trade, it will somehow be made safer. But sex can never be work, let alone safe work. Your body is not a workplace. The International Labor Organization defines unacceptable forms of work as work arrangements that deny fundamental principles and rights at work, put at risk the lives, health, freedom, human dignity, and security of workers. Prostitution meets this definition. And then to top it off, you have to purchase the consent. Today, we understand that consent is not as straightforward as just saying yes to a sexual act. Just look at the Me Too movement. That the National Sexual Violence Resource Center states, consent can be complicated when one partner holds more power than the other. And in this case, the money is the power. Speaking from my own experience, many of us would not have had sex with our buyers if money wasn't present. Now, I know you may be thinking, what about New Zealand and Australia? They support decriminalization, right? The New Zealand's government's own report showed that the majority of prostituted individuals felt that decriminalization did not lessen the amount of violence. Also, the majority of women and girls in the sex trade are Maori, Pacific Islanders, indigenous, or come from Asian countries. Likewise, in Australia, more than 50% of the women in Sydney's legal brothels were of Asian background or not fluent English speakers. In 2023, a senior Queensland investigator reported that Asian women were being moved like cattle across Australia and paid next to nothing, if at all. You may even think, well, what about organizations like Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch who support decriminalization? While those organizations do some tremendous work, they are not above scrutiny. They did not examine women's rights as human rights until the 1990s. They refused to recognize violence against women, like female genital mutilation or child marriage or even domestic violence, as human rights violations. So there are real consequences to policies like the one that Kaytlin is advocating for. And this is not just my opinion. In the US, we have tested this out. Rhode Island decriminalized indoor prostitution in 1980, and because of a significant rise in sex tourism and child sex trafficking, they not only reversed the law in 2009, but they added additional laws against the sex trade. There's a reason why they're the only state to ever try it. Decriminalization means all parties involved, the seller, the buyer, and the traffickers or third-party exploiters would have a free pass to engage in the sex trade. It would be irresponsible to decriminalize the purchasing of sex because men already break the law to do it now. And unfortunately, we do not have enough consensual, willing participants to fulfill the potential increased demand for paid sex if decriminalization were to happen. So what we will see is an increase in human trafficking, and children will be the first targets. So I urge you, as you listen to this conversation, as you gather your thoughts on this question, remember who this legislation would truly affect. How many of us truly get to have a Julia Roberts experience? Who was the most affected by this criminal enterprise? What effects would decriminalizing prostitution have on our country, on your local neighborhoods? Because I can guarantee you that you don't want to see what that looks like. Thank you.
Thank you, Melanie. All right, at this point, Kaytlin, you get 5 minutes for your rebuttal.
Thank you. The picture that Melanie paints of prostitution is horrific. But the problem with sex trafficking is the trafficking and not the sex. The overwhelming majority of people who are trafficked into agriculture, food processing, the fishing industry, and domestic labor. And the overwhelming majority of women who are trafficked are horribly sexually exploited, whether they are being trafficked into sex work or not. So I think it's important for us to remember that exploitation in all of its horrific forms is the real problem that we can and should be able to stand together against. But conflating respectful clients or consensual adults who choose to engage in this work with horrific violence and exploitation not only doesn't address the very real issues of systemic inequality and racial injustice that inform all of the exploitation that we see, but they actually hurt the very people intended to help. People that are trafficked into the sex industry are forced by a domestic abuser or a trafficker or a bully into selling sex against their will. And the overwhelming majority of people who are trafficked are themselves arrested. And when they meet with the police, they are not offered services. They are not offered help. Instead, they're saddled with a criminal record. And the fastest way to trap somebody into a life of prostitution is to have them arrested for it. And, you know, some people believe that if we simply decriminalize the selling side, but still maintain criminalization around the buying or facilitating side, that we can address this issue. But unfortunately, people that work together in the sex industry, sex workers and victims of trafficking, are arrested as pimps and traffickers and facilitators and promoters all of the time. And when you criminalize half a transaction, you push the entire industry further underground, and you give everyone involved good reasons to fear the police. Melanie brought up the history of prostitution. And Melanie's correct. The very first commercial brothels in Athens were, in fact, staffed by slaves. But before that, people engaged in temple prostitution ran the world. Before money, before, I don't want to get off on too much of a tangent here, but the exchange of erotic energy for something of value predates us as a species. And it's been an integral part of every, not just economy, but civilization. And in fact, you know, women in the United States, or white women in the United States, didn't get the right to vote until 1920. but sex workers settled the West. We were some of the largest landowners. Sex workers built New Orleans. The first woman to run for president in the United States was a sex worker. Victoria Woodhull announced her candidacy in 1870. She was the first woman to open up a brokerage firm on Wall Street. She was the first woman to address Congress on the issue of suffrage. And she was a sex worker. And many of her contemporaries, right, feminists who believe that they were standing with women, wrote her out of our history because of the deep-seated stigma against this work. Nobody believes that anyone should be forced or coerced or tricked into doing this or any other kind of work. But we should be directing our resources towards eradicating exploitation and all of the contributing factors that lead to people being vulnerable to those kinds of horrific abuses. But when instead we take that energy and we focus it on repressing sex, not only do we do nothing to alleviate the very real harms of violence and exploitation, but we hurt the very people we're trying to help. Thank you.
Thank you, Kaytlin. 5 minutes. Melanie, please take it away.
I don't even think I'll take the whole 5 minutes. So I find it very, very interesting that you say, Kaytlin, that, you know, this is a repression of sex, because what we're arguing for, what I'm arguing against, has nothing to do with sex. Because if you have ever been in prostitution, which I'm pretty sure half of you in this room have not, you actually recognize and understand that prostitution is actually more about power and control and not sex, right? And when I think of sex, I think of a mutually beneficial experience where erotic energies, if you will, are reciprocated, where there's a fair exchange of consent, right, and enjoyment. But like I said in my opening statement, if money is what's driving you to, quote unquote, enjoy the experience, then it's not actually sex. We're talking about this is a power imbalance. So for me to hear that this has anything to do with sexual repression, I find that to be quite amusing. But separate from that, you mentioned that we both agree that we don't want anybody to be criminalized or harmed. And I think a lot of the effects in society that you mentioned that happen to folks in the sex trade, unfortunately, are related directly to criminalization. And these are things that both of us don't support. That's what we currently have enacted in our 50 states, for those who don't know, with the exception of a few counties in Nevada. However, decriminalization, you know, you mentioned that you support exit services and exit strategies, and you are okay with those who are trafficked and exploited seeking help, but under full decriminalization, how can we possibly do that? Decriminalization as a law, if enacted, doesn't have anything written in its policy about exit strategies, health and safety concerns. It's simply deregulation and no state involvement, right? But there's nothing in there that says we're going to take money, say, from the people that are perpetuating, or we're going to charge fines and put it into exit services. We're going to help the individuals that were trafficked or in the sex trade from under whatever circumstance, right? Get mental health services or housing or things of that nature. So for me, this is pretty straight up and clear. And I think we as a society have been struggling culturally to wrap our heads around this. I think, more to your point about sexual repression, I think the topic of sex has been taboo for such a long time in our humanity. And I think people get very uncomfortable when we talk about it out loud, especially in public. And when it comes to this issue, if we were to think of any other industry, there's no industry out there that's completely deregulated, that is actually successful, that doesn't have any harmful consequences, right, on our society. And I think that when it comes to the issue of prostitution, and we're talking about predominantly women's bodies, we're talking about predominantly marginalized individuals' bodies, right? The people that they've already classified as, what's the word I'm looking for? That can be discarded, for example, right? When we're talking about people that are disposable, that's the word I was looking for. And when you think about who, like I mentioned, is the most impacted in society, right? It's not Kaytlin. It's not the people that look like Kaytlin predominantly. It's a small percentage of individuals that have and share Kaytlin's experience, as you mentioned. But the reality is that when we're talking about policy, we need to remember that we're not legislating for the minority. We're not talking about the small amount of people that have respectful buyers, that are respectful men and not criminals. Commodifying a person or putting a price tag or that on a value of the individual that you're about to have sex with, in and of itself should be a crime, right? But you know, I don't make the rules. The reality, however, is that when we're talking about the majority of individuals that are impacted by this issue, it's not a happy-go-lucky experience. The majority of our buyers are not nice to us. There's rape and sodomy, and I'm not gonna mention all the things because I'm gonna keep it PG, but there's a lot of things that happen or that have happened, even in my experience, to my body, right, that have nothing to do with sex, that have nothing to do with enjoying yourself or being happy, and that have nothing to do with criminalization. And it's unfortunate, me as somebody who, as a survivor, has gone through the system, I have been arrested, right? I have gone to jail. I have had some of these consequences that Kaytlin mentioned, but it had nothing to do with decriminalization being a help or a factor. It had nothing to do with sexual repression. It had to do with full criminalization. But on the flip side, I want us to remember that full decriminalization isn't going to help with exit services or strategies either.
Thank you both for the opening statements and the rebuttals. At this point, we'll open it up to questions. I'll start as the moderator with my moderator's prerogative questions. So Kaytlin, how do we make sure that the numbers that are coming in about, let's say, the immigrant community that's coming into the United States, a lot of them are coming from conservative backgrounds and they would rather die than declare that they have been raped or they have been sexually assaulted or have been trafficked in some way. How do we know that these numbers that you're referencing are covering the entire picture?
I'm so sorry, which numbers?
The numbers showing that the actual cases where trafficking is taking place with immigrant communities, with people that are coming into the United States, how do we know that there's not a massive underreporting because of people that are coming from communities
because
that
of
are
sexual
conservative?
shame? Is that the
Yeah.
issue? That makes sense. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I mean, we have trafficking visas, right? And there are people who are fleeing horrific sexual violence that do come here. I will say that everything that we've seen, trafficking is not overrepresented in the sex industry. It's overrepresented in the fishing industry. It's overrepresented in agriculture. It's overrepresented in domestic work. But I mean, even looking at like Cambodia, for example, they've done some deep research studies there that show that between 3.8 and 11% of people working in the sex industry in Cambodia have been trafficked, meaning forced fraud or coercion, which is the federal definition. Now, that is too many people, and it's an absolute tragedy. But if our goal is to eradicate trafficking and exploitation, then we shouldn't be focused on the sex industry. We should be focused on, frankly, all of the industries.
All right, thank you. Melanie, would you like to comment on the question? All right, so I have another question for you, and then we'll open it up. So we have our congressmen and women, they commodify themselves to lobbyists, for example. A lot of athletes in this country commodify their bodies to play D1 sports. What's the difference here? They're commodifying themselves. In a lot of cases, it's more deleterious to their bodies. It's deleterious to the way that their soul and mind. How is that different? How is sex work when someone, a woman or a man, commodifies their body for sex work? How is that different?
When we're talking about, this is the only profession, if you will, right? Prostitution is the only system that targets you based on gender inequality, based on your physical body parts. Now, granted, things like working on a football team, for example, right? That in and of itself can be exploitative, and that's a different history I don't want to get into, but that's also racially predicated, right? But the difference here, when we're talking about sex work, when we're talking about the point that Kaytlin was bringing up, the type of sex work that she was referring to comes from a very privileged standpoint. The majority of people that end up trafficked in prostitution, and you said something earlier about how trafficking is not that prevalent in the sex trade, but it actually is. The majority of people that are trafficked are there because of the lack of choices and because of circumstances that happen to them. Whereas a lot of these D1 sports and things of that nature are similar to the military, where recruiters are coming into the home and tackling them, or targeting them rather, on poverty. So yes, poverty is the basis for all of these criminal enterprises, including prostitution, but prostitution is the only one that's predicated on gender inequality.
Thank you. Kaytlin, would you like to comment on the question?
I just want to say that Melanie is right, that poverty is the underlying problem here, right? And that, like, if money is the deciding factor and anyone who's being offered money that they need to survive can't consent, then that calls into question all work.
Thank you both. All right, so at this point, we'll start taking questions from our audience in their homes. We have 300 people watching on Civil, which is huge. So thank you for all watching again, and please keep sending in your questions. We'll take the first one, but at any point, if either of you would like to ask a question to the other debater, please let me know. We will facilitate that. Please take it away, Casey, with our first Civil question.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Casey Given. I'm the Executive Director of Young Voices. I'll be popping up every 3 questions or so to ask questions from the live audience. We have a great audience of over 300 people watching live on Civil. So thank you so much, all of you online, for joining. We have a number of questions related to the distinction between decriminalization and legalization. I'll read 2 of them that are kind of similar but slightly distinct. Will decriminalization really make people safer than legalization, and why? And in general, do sex workers want legalization or decriminalization?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for asking it. Legalization is the model that we see in Nevada or Amsterdam or Germany. And this is a system that creates a regulatory structure that is unique to prostitution. And it requires sex workers to register with the state. In the case of Nevada, it requires sex workers to register with the sheriff's department, actually. It requires sex workers to work in legally licensed brothels that are often owned by men. It forces them to work in sort of rural and isolated places. And this inevitably creates a 2-tiered structure that only benefits brothel owners. So, for example, in Nevada, the only state in the union with legal regulated prostitution, you have the highest arrest rate per capita for prostitution-related offenses. Because there are a lot of good reasons why somebody who wants to engage in this work wouldn't want to do so within a licensed brothel, right? They don't want to put themselves on a stigmatized list. They don't want to work for one of those guys. They don't want to work 12 or 24-hour shifts, or they want to see clients where they live and work in Vegas or Reno, where it's impossible to work legally. So sex workers all over the world are united that we want decriminalization, which means removing criminal penalties. Now, this allows for brothels to exist and people can choose to work there, but it also allows for people to work independently out of their homes or hotel rooms without working for a boss. Thanks.
Melanie, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I just want to add that although legalization and decriminalization are often distinct because of the things that Kaytlin just mentioned, there is state regulation and things of that nature, I want to highlight and emphasize that there is no major difference in the violence because the penalties are obsolete on both sides with legalization and decriminalization when it comes to the buyers who perpetuate the harm.
All right, let's go to our first in-house question. Please take it away.
I have a question, one for each of you. For Kaytlin, under decriminalization, without a regulatory structure or licensing framework, how would you see your opposition to exploitation and trafficking carried out if the authorities don't know where the sex work is taking place or who the sex workers are to be able to audit them? And for Melanie, do you see pornography as just prostitution with a camera? And would all of your arguments extend over to pornography as well?
Take it away.
Great, yeah. I'm sorry, I had a little brain fuzz. The question was, yeah, I got distracted by the pornography question.
The regulatory, without a regulatory
without regulation,
framework.
yes, absolutely. Yeah, I think this is a really important point. Decriminalizing sex work, right, removes criminal penalties for the consensual exchange of sex for money, right? But it doesn't remove criminal penalties for rape or kidnap or sexually exploiting a minor. And so when you free police officers from trying to repress people engaged in consensual sex, you allow them to actually go after the traffickers. Like, for example, when Backpage was taken down, law enforcement agencies all over the country were aghast that it suddenly became a lot harder to prosecute predators because because they were no longer able, because the things that came in to replace Backpage were not as cooperative with law enforcement. So when you allow consensual adult sex workers to operate openly, you also allow folks to report crimes committed against them or crimes that they witness, right? Then, according to the Sex Work Project here at Urban Justice Center, the overwhelming majority of trafficking victims that receive services are referred by clients. So when, when seeing a sex worker is not criminalized, when doing adult consensual sex work is not criminalized, that actually frees people to seek services and to report crimes committed against them without trying to repress the whole thing. Thanks.
Thank you for your question. So yes, personally, my arguments do extend to pornography, and I do believe that pornography is prostitution on camera. There are a lot of individuals who are sex trafficked, who are recorded, those videos are sold to porn sites. There's revenge porn. That's another category we can talk about at a different time, but I do think they're related. And the one thing I do want to highlight with pornography is that pornography in many places, including here, is often used as either a grooming tool for those that are getting into the sex trade, usually under a third party or trafficker or a third party exploiter, or a lot of folks that are in prostitution that are trafficked, their videos end up in pornography.
All right, thank you for this question. For the next one, let's keep it at just one, even though the first question was two parts that were strong. So, yeah, just one, moving on, and keep it brief. Thank you.
Hello. Sorry. Yeah, the question's for Melanie. I think you said 85% of people who do sex work do it because they don't have, I think, better opportunities. So how would banning that and make it illegal give them like better opportunities?
I think the resources need to be put into trying to increase our living wages, right? Creating opportunities that have entryways that are not necessarily standard. So maybe removing some of the barriers for folks to get jobs, right? Like maybe removing the citizenship barrier, or maybe removing a higher level college degree, things of that nature. Putting our efforts and focusing more on trying to address the underlying issues that got us into prostitution in the first place is the most important.
Kaytlin, would you like to comment? All right, let's go to the third question.
Hello. So I just wanted to give some context to my question. I think what makes prostitution unique is that the product is the woman's body, and the only value that comes is a man's ejaculation. So my question is, how do you reconcile the commodification of women and women's sexuality that, in essence, further objectifies women as not a product of misogyny, as separate or, divorced from misogyny? And how do you arrive at that conclusion?
How do I separate prostitution from misogyny?
Or just, the commodification of women's bodies as, rooted in misogyny?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, we see the commodification of women's bodies, again, across labor sectors, right? Talking about waitresses, bartenders, actresses, models. There's a lot of commodification of women's bodies, appearances, and attention that is ubiquitous. But criminalizing prostitution or trying to push it further underground does nothing to alleviate the long history of misogyny. Instead, it sicks, right, the violence power of the state on the most vulnerable people. I mean, and even when clients are criminalized and not sex workers, the overwhelming majority of people who are arrested for this are Black, brown, and living below the poverty line. So we know what state violence looks like, and that can't be an answer here. Again, Melanie and I stand together. We want to raise the options of everyone engaged, not just in this work, but across labor sectors. I don't think anyone should be forced into prostitution, either by circumstance or coercion, but I also don't think that people should be forced into the fishing industry because of lack of options or circumstances or coercion. So, that's where, that's the distinction. Does that make sense? Sorry.
Melanie, would you like to comment?
I was just going to say, to your question, you can't. Prostitution its entire foundation is based on sexism, patriarchy, misogyny, colonialism, and racism, and many other isms, and I could keep going on. But that is what makes prostitution thrive. So there's absolutely no way that you can separate them. We can talk about exploitation and commodification amongst labor sectors and everything, but again, there are nuances to prostitution, and there are specificities in prostitution that are specific to it, and it thrives because of these oppressions and isms. And the majority of people that are in prostitution fall into those oppressive categories.
Thank you both. Thank you for the question. One more live question, then we'll go for a civil one. All right, please go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Dorchen Leithold, and I direct the Center for Battered Women's Legal Services at Sanctuary for Families. Gloria Steinem famously described prostitution as bodily invasion. Was she right or wrong when she described it as such? What other form of work, if we want to call prostitution work, big question mark, involves anything comparable to the intimate invasion involved in prostitution? And what are the short-term and long-term consequences to that intimate invasion?
Thank you.
Well, I am not the judge or the jury. I can't say if she's right or wrong. I could say for me, I absolutely 100% agree with Gloria Steinem in that. I personally don't know any other industry, although majority of industries are exploitative to an extent under capitalism. There's no other exploitative industry that has the same amount or levels of bodily invasion, right? And what we've seen, right, I mentioned briefly PTSD, the psychological effects are uncomparable to anything else. But what we also find are high rates of things like vaginal prolapse, rectal prolapse, right? Fisting has gone inside the women's bodies, right, and messed up a lot of organs. There are people that have the inability to conceive. The list is endless, and we can talk about it afterwards. But I want folks to understand that there are no other industries that invade the body as such, or target bodies of a marginalized and oppressed gender that end up in the same way that Gloria Steinem was talking about.
I actually disagree. Yeah, I mean, look, I'm a soldier's daughter, right? And my father was sent to multiple combat tours, and I was raised in a military culture where, you know, people that signed up to be a part of the military were sent literally to their deaths, exposed to horrific chemicals. I mean, my father died a few years ago from exposure to Agent Orange in Vietnam. I have other friends of mine who have sold their eggs or their plasma or other things to make ends meet. I think that there are examples of horrific bodily harm that happen in all kinds of industries. But I think that this aversion that we have to all things sexual has really colored our perspective and our ability to see that. And I will also say, in the case of Gloria Steinem was denied an apartment when she was working as the editor of Ms. Magazine because her landlord didn't believe that a woman could be making that much money without engaging in prostitution. So she herself is literally a victim of whorephobia against this work because the landlord did not want to be participating in prostitution. He assumed that that's what she was doing. So these laws don't just hurt sex workers directly, but they actually create barriers for all women to access the basic building blocks that we need to move our lives forward. Because when you criminalize clients and third-party folks, I mean, landlords are criminalized in Sweden and Norway and Iceland and places where these laws have been implemented. Thank you.
Thank you both. Now for our second civil question. Please take it away, Casey.
Yes, that's a good segue. Actually, there's a question about the Nordic model of could there be a middle ground of criminalizing the demand for sex, Johns, but decriminalizing those who provide it, sex workers. What do you think of the Nordic model in general? Could that be an alternative or perhaps a solution to this?
So that is something that I believe Kaytlin briefly mentioned that I personally advocate for. It's referred to as the equality model or the third way. So we have criminalization, which is what we currently have in our states. We have full decriminalization, which is what Kaytlin is advocating for. And then we have this partial way, the equality model, where we decriminalize those who are selling the sex or the person that's trafficked or the person in me and Kaytlin's scenario. And then we keep our current penalties in place for those who perpetuate the system of violence, i.e. the buyers, the traffickers, other third-party exploiters. And for me personally, I have many things that I like about this proposed legislation. Personally, it's the only one that actually talks about aftercare services. And as I mentioned earlier, full decriminalization does nothing to address A, health and safety, or B, exit strategies or services. Whereas the equality model is something where not only will they remove you from the current situation or work with you to exit once you're ready to exit, but it also focuses on, well, what do you need now so that we can prevent you relapsing, right? And that is the true change that we need to see if we're talking about decreasing violence in the sex trade or even decreasing the sex trade itself. And the other thing that I want to note with the equality model, I think there's a misconception that people have, if you've heard about it, that it has it's making stronger laws and harsher laws against the people that are perpetuating, you know, what Kaytlin would call her clients, right? That it's making it worse for them. It's making it, it's adding to the stigma. The equality model does not add any harsher penalties to those who perpetuate. It just maintains the penalties we currently have. And I think folks need to understand if trafficking and the system of prostitution is already this bad with the laws that we have, then keeping it here is not going to add on to the harm of the violence.
The goal of what you're calling the equality model or the feminist model, this is a policy that goes by many names, right? The Nordic model, the Swedish model, some people call it the entrapment model. But the goal of these policies is to eradicate prostitution. And when you make it the state's #1 priority to make something go away, it gets really difficult to help people that are choosing to participate in that industry. And when you criminalize half a transaction, you push the entire thing underground. But I can tell you, speaking to folks in like Sweden and Norway who have been living with these policies for decades, what happens when you criminalize clients but not sex workers is you undermine all of the safety strategies that we use to try to keep ourselves safe, right? If I am negotiating an appointment with somebody, and what I want to keep myself safe is I want to know that guy's name, I want to know where he works, I want to know other industry references that he's seen, people that he has presumably not harmed or robbed or upset in some way. Under this model, where only he is facing criminal penalties but not I, he has no reason to give me that information. And I can't tell the difference between a reasonable, rational person who's trying to save themselves from arrest versus a predator posing as a client who's trying to get around my screening practices. So what I can say is that the immediate aftermath of these policies is you focus the energy on the state of making this go away, right? So when anyone who is in the sex industry reports a crime committed against them or tries to get help, the #1 priority of law enforcement or a social worker is to make them stop selling sex, to prevent them from relapsing, right? That's the goal, rather than addressing the actual harm. And you create an antagonistic relationship between clients and providers that creates a real barrier between us being able to execute the safety protocols that we want, whether that's getting information from our clients or being able to work together, which would legally become pimping under that model. Thank you.
So Melanie, I saw that you're shaking your head. I'll open the round for one more round of rebuttals, or come back.
Yeah, I'm shaking my head because you were talking about safety protocols and negotiating power. And again, like I mentioned, that's a very privileged point of view. And again, when we're talking about policy, we're talking about the majority of people that are impacted, not the few of you that were able to negotiate your prices. In my experience, buyers don't even give you their real information for obvious reasons, right? The majority of buyers are white, middle-aged men with disposable income. Many of them married, many of them in families, and many of them usually seek those in prostitution because they either A, don't want to do the things that they do to us, to their wives, or B, because they're not satisfied at home. More than just the looking for connection argument that some people say. And I want folks to understand that decriminalization, A, wouldn't make any differences in that kind of safety protocol, whatever. What we do find is that buyers usually give you a fake name. I've never had a buyer show me their ID because obviously that's a legal name. Now, it's not to say that there aren't some people in prostitution who may or may not have seen it. All I know is that when that has happened, usually that is a regular that has been coming around for a while and eventually builds trust with you or whatever. But the reality is that there's no way to ensure if a client is safe prior to meeting that person. Usually prostitution consists of clients coming to you, the buyers, the Johns, coming to your face. You get to maybe, if you're lucky, peek out of a window before they come in to see what they're wearing and if they look threatening. And then when they get in the room, you don't know if that's gonna be the day that you're killed or not. So I'm shaking my head because I think safety protocols are.
Kaytlin.
Yeah, under decriminalization, what I will say is that the overwhelming majority of energy that sex workers spend under criminalization is to avoid detection by the police. When you remove that, you free up that energy to do exactly this, right? To advocate for yourself, to build relationships with other sex workers and exchange information. I mean, I didn't come up with the screening references or ID check on my own. I found that out on a message board that sex workers were using to trade information with each other, to advertise their services, and to help people do this work safely. And I will say that visiting, legal brothels in legal brothels in New Zealand and talking to independent sex workers, under decriminalization, that's absolutely a very normal protocol. And that's possible because nobody involved is committing a crime. But when you criminalize clients or when you criminalize the selling or facilitating of sex work, you add this whole other layer that, again, pushes the industry further underground, and you can't hold criminals accountable.
Thank you both. All right, let's take another question.
Hello, my name is Audrey. I'm a queer sex worker here in New York City. I've been working for the last 7 years on my own volition and choice. Sex work has raised me out of debt. It has freed me from a situation where I was being financially abused by my parents, and it even allowed me to buy an apartment in Brooklyn, something that I never thought I would be able to do. I have friends who were once homeless, and they have used sex work to get off the street, and one is even now testing for the bar. If you believe prostitution should be kept illegal, what alternative forms of income generation or support systems should be implemented in our late capitalist society, where queer and undocumented people like me and my cohorts and coworkers who choose to use sex work to get out of even worse situations, out of poverty and debt? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I too am a queer person, so thank you for speaking up for our community for the first person of the night. And I want to say congratulations to your friend who is about to go to the bar. That's amazing. Again, that's not representative of the majority of us who go through prostitution. And you also mentioned that you have friends that were homeless that use prostitution to get out of that, which further goes to my point that sex work can't be a true job like any other, and that the majority of us that are there because of a lack of choice or circumstance. But again, I'm not advocating for full decriminalization or full criminalization. I'm looking at the equality model, and like I mentioned, I think most of our resources and most of our energy needs to be more focused on trying to tackle the underlying systems of poverty, those oppressive systems that cause homelessness or houselessness, right? Focusing on exit strategies and trying to find ways to get money back into our local communities is the first step, I think, in addressing some of these nuances that make folks see prostitution as a viable option.
Kaytlin, would you like to add?
No, I just want to say that thank you for sharing your story. And you and your friends are not alone. Sex work has helped people escape abusive relationships and poverty. And I believe that sex work has funded more students, artists, and entrepreneurs than all of the grants combined. But I know that we think differently about that.
All right, next question.
Hi, so I'm a queer, non-binary survivor of the sex trade. I've worked with other folks who lived in living experience for the last over 6 years, and the majority of folks that we work with aren't exchanging sex for money, but rather for drugs or a place to stay, like basic necessities. And the conflation of consent with money and power really concerns me. So my question is, what implications does full decriminalization have on folks impacted by substance use disorder that are in the sex trade? And what, if any, implications does this have for consent related to sex in other contexts? Thank you.
So yeah, I mean, substance use disorder is terrible. I have lots of friends whose lives have been destroyed by substance abuse. I think it's the decriminalization of sex work obviously doesn't do anything to alleviate either the horrible reality of substance abuse, nor does it do anything about the war on drugs, which I'm sure, it compounds a lot of the harms of addiction. But desperate people do desperate things. And when desperate people are doing desperate things, if one of their options is sex work, that is something that they will do, but people steal to get their drug habit met. People destroy relationships. People do a lot of socially unacceptable and self-harm things. And so I think it's important for us to separate out this issue that substance abuse and poverty and the realities of terribly vulnerable people doing everything that they can to survive or get their needs met, that's a reality that we see everywhere, whether prostitution is legal or decriminalized or not, or who's facing arrest. But yeah, so I'm sorry that happened.
Yeah, and I would just briefly add that I believe there's going to be, the same way there will be an increase in trafficking within the sex trade, under full decriminalization, there will also be increased drug usage, both either being utilized by the individuals that are in the sex trade or used as a grooming tactic.
Would you like to add anything, Kaytlin?
No, I'm just, can you help me make that connection? Why do you believe that the decriminalization of sex work would lead to more substance use anywhere?
The majority, not the majority. There are quite a few individuals that are already in the sex trade, either A, because they're trying to, as that woman mentioned, continue to fuel their substance abuse disorder, but it's also a grooming tactic used by a lot of traffickers to get people to come into the sex trade and remain there. So it's a way of continuing to control the people that are already there, and helping or assisting with their disassociation when they're having multiple buyers a day and can't mentally stomach that.
Next question.
How do you do? My name is Spiros, and I am the chapter executive of the New York chapter of the American Communist Party. And I'm here to ask primarily for the advocate for decriminalization, why focus on decriminalizing prostitution as a solution to financial struggles? Because obviously that's the main point that both of you are arguing here. When it fails to address the root economic issues facing working people, especially working women. Instead, why not demand a constitutional right to well-paying jobs, to enhance Social Security, medical care, and child care, solutions that are productive, that contribute to the good of society?
I think that Melanie and I would both like to eradicate poverty. I think that is something that we could stand behind. I don't believe that I don't believe that if we were living in a communist utopia where nobody had to engage in any work against their will, I believe that sex work would still happen. I myself, and I know many other people who felt called to this work. And so I don't believe that in an ideal world where nobody is engaging in any work that they find distasteful or harmful, that the eradication of prostitution would come from that necessarily. But I also think that we're a lot closer to decriminalizing prostitution than we are to eradicating poverty. And so I think that the harms that we can remove through the criminalization of sex work, through sicking the police on people, that's something that we can do today while we work towards a future where nobody is forced to do anything by circumstance. Thanks.
Melanie, a comment on the ACP question?
I was just going to say thank you for your question. I have the exact same question, and I think that we need to, as previously mentioned, focus our resources on trying to eradicate poverty, but I don't think prostitution is the avenue in which we need to do that.
All right, at this point, we'll take a third question from Civil. Right now, we have 400 people watching.
Yes, this will be the last one of the night from the online audience. So obviously we're here in New York City, but a lot of people watching live are in small towns across the US. So there's a few questions about kind of the effect that decriminalizing prostitution would have on small towns. Specifically, one asks, would sex decriminalization attract criminality? Would towns become like red light districts? And another person asks kind of a converse question. And in my neighborhood, there's a group of prostitutes that walk the highway. Would decriminalization give them a safer place to do business? So kind of the effect of decriminalization on small towns and kind of the infrastructure of where the business is sold.
Thank you to our audience on civil. Take it away.
Thank you. I will say that we know what prohibition does to markets, and it doesn't make them safer. The criminality that's often associated with sex work and prostitution is because sex work and prostitution are criminalized, forcing them into, criminal systems. I will say that you do that under decriminalization in New Zealand, street-based prostitution still exists, but there are a lot more options for people because the work that they're engaged in is not a crime. They can rent hotel rooms without fear of being evicted. They can rent spaces. So I don't know the specific situation. I know that there are folks that choose to do this work because they have a community or it's where they find their clients. And decriminalization doesn't necessarily make that go away, but it does help people that don't want to be working on the street, expands their options to do that work elsewhere. Thanks.
I just want to say, yes, we know what prohibition does to markets, but we also know that when prohibition, specifically with alcohol, was overturned, we also saw an increase in alcoholism and so many other side effects. But to your question, yes, if we fully decriminalize, anticipate seeing our city, our state, our country full of red light districts, right? And granted, those who are engaging in prostitution will have more opportunities to, say, purchase different venues to do whatever they want to do. But because of the increase in traffic, it's not just going to be an increase in trafficking that we're going to see there. We're also going to see an increase in sex tourism. And what that does is now bring folks from other places to come to New York, for example, to now purchase sex the same way that they go to the Dominican Republic or Brazil or Amsterdam. Because there's such an increased demand now that there are no penalties or worries of arrest or any kind of consequences, we'll see more people coming to the state that our state can't handle, right? We'll see an increase in trafficking, and we'll see an increase in the amount of foot traffic that are going to the various venues that sex workers are deciding to purchase for their servicing.
Please go ahead.
Good evening. My name is Meredith Kershaw. My question is for Kaytlin. You mentioned that since New Zealand decriminalised the sex trade, that people in prostitution, New Zealanders in prostitution, have been safer. However, there have been no human trafficking prosecutions in the last 4 years in New Zealand, and I believe that there have only been 4 in total since 2009. So given this, is it your belief that no people in prostitution in New Zealand are or have been sex trafficked in the last 5 years to 15 years? And if not, how can you say that people in prostitution in New Zealand have been safer since decriminalisation? Thanks.
Thank you for that question. So I can say that people in New Zealand are safer after decriminalization because STI rates and violence against women have fallen, and you've seen a 70% increase in sex workers' willingness to report crimes committed against them. I don't believe that there's a lot of trafficking happening in New Zealand, and the trafficking that you do see is concentrated among the migrant community, which were excluded from the decrim policy. So New Zealand decriminalized prostitution in 2003 with the exception of migrants. And so you see horrific cases of abuse, but they're happening within this vulnerable class that was excluded from the protections of decrim.
Melanie, would you like to come? Okay. One more.
Hello. My question to Kaytlin is, would you encourage a trans person living in Syria, Ukraine, or Vietnam to engage in prostitution as a way to get them out of debt or homelessness?
I would never encourage anyone to do this work. That's not my job. But people that are doing this work, I believe, should be able to do this work safely and with dignity.
Would you encourage your own child to be a prostitute if they decide to do so?
If I'm lucky enough to become a mother, I hope that my child knows that they can always come to me and that I will always support them.
Melanie, would you like to comment?
I have a separate question for Melanie.
What? All right. Please go ahead.
Can you clarify how race representation works in prostitution? I had an impression that you first said that Black and Indigenous women account for more than 30% of prostituted people, but in subsequent statements you mentioned them being the majority. Maybe I misunderstood that.
Yeah, I think you did. So I said 90+% of us are Black, brown, or Indigenous. There's a small percentage of individuals that are white, and it's not to say that white people are not harmed, trafficked, or in the sex trade, but collectively we make up the majority. Now, Black people specifically, we make up less than 6% of the U.S. population, but over 13% of, over 90% of the population in prostitution. So I'm not sure if that clarified.
Thank you for your question.
Hi, this question is for both. My name is Cristian Eduardo. I'm a survivor of the sex trade prostitution from 3 different countries. I'm a queer immigrant, non-citizen. I'm not a native English speaker. So, and the reality is that I saw the same thing in the 3 countries. But my question is, why we never talk, and content warning for everyone, why we never talk about sex buyers, why we refer to them as clients instead of calling them what they are doing, buying sex, when we need to do screenings, when we are keeping statistics because they are the ones who they pay more for unprotected sex, raw bareback sex. They pay more for sex acts that include feces, urination, or blood. And when the prostitution, it's actually keeping and maintaining because of the disposable income. Why we never share this reality and why we are protecting sex buyers instead of those impacted by prostitution?
Thank you for your question.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing your question, but I'm sorry, I don't fully understand the question. So I understand that there are predators and horrible people that pay vulnerable people to do terrible, degrading, and debasing things. And I don't think that either of us support that. But I don't understand how the language, I mean, there are clients and there are predators, and being able to distinguish between those two feels foundational to being able to bring people that cause other people harm to justice.
Yes, my question is, why do we call them clients instead of sex buyers when they are doing harm?
I'm happy to use any language that you feel comfortable with. If sex buyers feels more appropriate, then we can do that. I will say that, you know, there are people in this industry that they're not paying for actual sex acts, but sure, if sex buyers makes you feel more comfortable, then we can use that language.
It's not about me, it's about the people engaging in the sex trade and prostitution.
Sure.
Thank you. Melanie, would you like to add anything?
Just that I agree that buyers are 100% part of the problem. And I think that when we talk about the sex trade, we focus a lot on usually the woman that's in the sex trade, or we talk about their pimps or traffickers, and we do often leave out of the conversation the sex buyers, right? And they inflict majority of the harm, and they hold majority of the power, because when you're behind closed doors with that person, they're the ones that usually use money or a place to stay or food to eat or resources as a means of control. So I agree. Thank you for your question.
All right, we're running out of time, so what I would like us to do is ask your questions, and hopefully the 2 debaters will address your questions in their closing statements. And I'll start us off actually with just one final question that we got from viewers on Civil. How does the existence of male sex workers challenge any of the points made in this debate? Can you briefly address that, the position that male sex workers and how they affect this conversation? And yeah, please go ahead, take some notes as we get the last 4 questions, and hopefully you'll get ample time to address them in your 5 closing minutes.
What I wanted to ask is, if prostitution becomes a legitimized or decriminalized industry where arrest isn't possible, how would law enforcement work? How would you actually find trafficking? What incentive would law enforcement have to go after it? Considering all the problems that every city has, how is that going to rise to the top to do that when it's decriminalized? And where are the tools going to be? Because right now, the promotion of prostitution is one of the key ways that law enforcement is able to identify and start to investigate some of these really naughty, as in a not complex, domestic and international trafficking rings.
Thank you. Next one.
So if decriminalization or basically reducing the laws on prostitution, do you see more women getting into this kind of work? And because of that, like a higher supply, do you see reduction in trafficking?
Thank you. Last two. Melanie, would you like a pen? No. All right, good.
So my question is, it was mentioned a few times that people are exploited in the mining and farming and whatever industries. Those industries, mining, fishing, whatever, those are pretty socially necessary for producing the material basis for the reproduction of society. Do you believe that sex work helps to reproduce civilization and civilizational harmony? Thank you.
Last question.
I have a very similar question. You equate exploitation across industries where there's a crucial difference between exploited labor that produces necessary goods like fishing or agriculture versus the exploitation of trafficked women whose bodies are repeatedly rented for sex. There's an increased degree of exploitation in the sex trafficked women scenario. Given that studies like Cunningham and Shaw in 2018 show decriminalization increases the overall market size and thus incentivizes more trafficking, how do you justify supporting decriminalization knowing it would lead to an increased number of women being sexually exploited?
All right, thank you all for these excellent questions. And rest assured, the two debaters will be here after the conclusion of this debate to mingle and have some drinks. You'll have ample time to ask them and get any last questions that you have unanswered, answered for you. So at this point, 5 minutes, Kaytlin, for you to close off your segment of the debate, and then followed by 5 minutes for Melanie, and then we will open the final vote. Please take it away.
Yeah, thank you. I will say that all kinds of people engage in this work, right? As sex buyers, as providers, people of all genders come to this work for all kinds of reasons and under all kinds of circumstances. But people of all genders have always sold sexual services. I will say that we have a lot more history and interest in controlling the female body, specifically female sexuality, which is why the overwhelming majority of the ways that we've policed prostitution historically is about controlling where women go, what they wear, and who they associate with. And anti-prostitution and anti-pornography laws have led to the criminalization of information about birth control and a lot of harms that really hurt our ability to participate as full members in society. I mentioned the story before about Gloria Steinem being discriminated against when she was looking for an apartment, and that's because her landlord didn't want to rent to a sex worker. But in a world where engaging in this work in and of itself is not a crime, then we can focus our energies on the people who are perpetuating harm in this industry. There was an excellent question here of like, well, if we decriminalize adult consensual sex work, how will law enforcement find the traffickers? Well, by responding to complaints. If, as a sex worker, I am not engaged in a crime and the people that are purchasing my services are also not engaged in a crime, then when crimes occur, we can report them. Then we can report them without fear. It also reduces barriers to accessing services. Melanie said many times before that the decriminalization of prostitution does not create exit services. Well, that's also true of the criminalization of clients in Norway and Sweden and Iceland and Canada and all of these places that have criminalized sex buyers. They have not funded funded. They have not sufficiently funded exit services for people that are trying to get out of that work. Instead, they create barriers for people that are interested in, like, if they're interested in reporting crimes committed against them or accessing those services, they become conditional on whether or not the person seeking those services is able or willing to stop selling sex before getting access to any of those services. I also wanted to mention before, Melanie, you brought up this, I think, important story for folks to understand about something that happened in Rhode Island, because it's the only example of decriminalization that we've had here in the United States. In the 1980s, Coyote, the first sex worker-led organization in the United States, which stands for Call Off Your Old Tired Ethics, sued the state of Rhode Island for sex discrimination because only women were being arrested for selling sexual services and men were not being arrested for buying. The Rhode Island legislature agreed and struck those laws from the books, but nobody noticed until 2003 when a personal injury attorney, somebody came to him and said that they'd been arrested for prostitution. And so between 2003 and 2009, indoor sex work in Rhode Island was decriminalized. And although Melanie is correct that you saw a lot of activity around that, you also saw a dramatic reduction in STI rates and violence against women. Gonorrhea rates dropped 40%, and reported rates dropped 30%. One of the goals of decriminalizing sex work is not to increase the industry. And in a place like New Zealand, right, which is an island, when sex work was decriminalized, there's no evidence that there are more people engaged in that work today. And that's based on counting the number of online ads, which were not censored before 2003. I think it's here in New York City, when clients are criminalized and targeted, the overwhelming majority of people who are arrested are poor men of color. And I know that there's a lot of energy now around what's happening on Roosevelt, Operation Clean Up Roosevelt. But we have a group of vulnerable people who are subjected to all kinds of exploitation. But instead of offering those people services, we're sending in undercover police officers to pose as willing clients, offering money that people desperately need, and then arresting people for taking that deal. That's what policing prostitution looks like, and we should stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Kaytlin. Five minutes, Melanie.
So thank you, everybody. You've heard a lot of information tonight, and this is not an easy topic, and I want to thank you all for being here in good faith and hopefully with open minds. Now, I have a lot to rebuttal with that. Please find me after if you're interested in hearing those thoughts. For now, I will stick to my written remarks. Debating policy is complicated, and it's nuanced, but to me, this issue, what to do about prostitution, is actually not that complicated. We have to create and support legislation that protects the health, safety, and human rights of all people. Remember that we do not create laws for the minority or those with just lucky experiences. So while some might not have had a negative experience in prostitution, just like you might smoke cigarettes and not get cancer or not wear a seatbelt and be fine, most of us do suffer consequences. We get emphysema or we fly through the windshield. But in prostitution, we are raped, we are beaten, we are traumatized. And while Kaytlin and I both agree that those that are purchased for or selling sex should be decriminalized and have access to health and safety, I cannot support legislation that also decriminalizes the pimps, the buyers, the traffickers who perpetuate a system of violence, racism, and misogyny. No law is able to differentiate who is selling sex by choice and who has been trafficked or coerced. No law can make the sex trade safe, and no law can fully remove the stigma. That's all up to you. The system of prostitution is one built on patriarchy, colonialism, racism, and you have to wonder, as was said here many times tonight, why are we wasting our energy defending it instead of pouring our energy and ideas into creating affordable housing or employment that offers livable wages? As long as there is a marketplace where women, where human beings are up for sale, whether they choose to be there or not, we will be a fundamentally unequal society. And the fact that most of these women look like me shows that prostitution is an outgrowth of not only a patriarchal society, but also a racist one. Additionally, there is this misconception that I want to address, that people who don't support full decriminalization are moralistic. We're not sex positive. We're some sort of religious prude, if you will. And in reality, my views have nothing to do with religion, nothing to do with sex positivity, and nothing to do with wanting to control what goes on in people's bedrooms. I want everyone to have mutually consensual sex. I want what goes on in people's bedrooms to be just the thing that they truly enjoy. I want LGBTQ+ youth to grow up believing that they can do whatever they want that doesn't include exploiting their bodies or exploiting their houselessness. I want Black women to be free from a world where their privileged counterparts don't further oppress them by defending a culture that says it's okay to buy them. And I want women and children to enjoy the full spectrum of their freedom without having to give even a moment of it to a man who believes that he paid for it. This country has a very long history of commodifying human beings, the most vulnerable and marginalized among us, particularly Black, brown, and indigenous women and girls. I will not support any policy that packages up this commodification as empowerment or as a way out of poverty, and I hope that at some point you also agree. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Melanie. Thank you, Kaytlin, for an excellent debate. I think you've achieved the aims of myself, Young Voices, and Civil, and you did it with stellar flying colors. So thank you very much. Another round of applause for an excellent debate. At this point, please take out your phones once more and scan this QR code for your post-debate vote. And again, the way we tabulate the score, the quote-unquote winner of this final debate, is by seeing who is able to sway more people to their side. As we do that, Casey, the CEO of Young Voices, has some remarks and some final comments.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Kaytlin. Thank you so much, Melanie. This has been a fantastic debate. This is our third Young Voices debate we've had over the last 3 months. I have been incredibly just amazed by the turnout. We have, I think, close to 150 people here in the room tonight. And I'm pleased to report over 500 people watching live right now on Civil. I'm extremely grateful for the turnout, and thank you to our partners at Civil as well. We'll be doing these actually now every other month live in New York City, thanks in part to Civil support in the Foundation for Harmony and Prosperity. So I hope you can come out to a future debate. We'll send you info by email in the future. For those of you who don't know Young Voices, we are a nonprofit talent agency for classical liberal policy writers out of college. We help them get their first op-eds published. We help them get onto TV, radio, and we do cool events like this one. So if you are interested in being a public speaker and being a public writer, taking your career in thought leadership to the next level, please check us out. Our URL is joinyv.org. We're always looking for new writers. Or if you have an intern, a student, a son, a daughter who might be interested in journalism, media, academia, we would love to help you out. As for the Young Voices debate, we will be doing our next one online in February, I believe on OnlyFans, so kind of a similar subject to what we had tonight. And our next one in March will be here in the Blue Building on free speech and the question of anti-Semitism on college campuses. That should also be another very spicy topic to discuss. So I hope you'll join us there. With that, are we good for the results? I'll turn it back over to Hekmat. Thank you.
All right. Final show in the room, if anyone is still voting. All right, great. Thank you all. And as Casey mentioned, February, we have a debate on OnlyFans, which I'm sure will interest a lot of people in this audience. And then March, we have a debate on college, anti-Semitism, and freedom of speech. All right, so I have here the results for the final tally. The debate result, the tallies have officially been closed. All right, so we started off with the pre-vote of agree. Around 44.50% of this crowd and the crowd online agreed with the statement. 39 disagreed with the statement, and 16.3 were undecided. And the change, we are now at 43% agreeing, 46.15 disagreeing, and 11% undecided. So very close. And now we look at the change. So it seems that the disagree has gained 7.61%, and the agree has dropped by 2.17%. So congratulations, Melanie, you have won this debate. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for everyone who watched online. And we will conclude with a final little bumper from Civil. All right, thank you all. And again, Melanie and Kaytlin will be here, and they will be happy to answer any final questions you might have. Please be merry, enjoy the drink and food that we have provided. Thank you all.